So the premise of this elective is that we're going to be talking about how hello. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So we're going to be talking about how different AFs are reading vague plans and how we as negative teams can punish them in a way that is more intelligent than just going for vagueness as a theory violation. So to kind of start this off, I'm curious if you all have debated any vague plans over the last couple of years of debate that stand out to you. Yeah. Ensure the right to water, for sure, for sure. There was a lot of like water topic plans that just said very, very vague nonsense where they like specified kind of the goal of what the plan would be, like ensuring the right to water, but didn't really describe what the mechanism for it would be. Anyone else? Oh yeah, a ton of people did this on CJR for some reason, where they like read like just the whole resolution or the whole subset of the area and then would read like solvency evidence about a specific part of the area, and it's like, oh, you know, pay no attention here, the plan was this thing all along, right? So yeah, a thing that stuck out to me from last year, and I think was the thing that inspired me to throw this together, was there was a Peninsula team that read an AF about water markets where the plan was just the United States federal government should regulate water markets. Yeah. Yeah. You know, no hate for them. I appreciate a good vague plan. But like judging that particular one made me feel like the situation was getting out of hand. And so it made me start thinking about like, how could we actually punish teams for doing this, and like what kind of cost we could actually impose that a judge might potentially vote for. So like core problem is that when you go for vagueness and you just say like vagueness is a voting issue or like vagueness is a theory violation, the problem that you run into is that the 2AC is going to get up. They're going to be like, where in the resolution does it say we have to specify? And they're going to be like, how much do we have to specify? You just made it up. It's ambiguous. You're going to ask for more detail every time. There's no bright line for how much we're supposed to specify. So like, fuck this, basically. And most judges that I know are going to vote AF in that situation because it's like kind of a true set of objections. Like the neg is really just whining about vagueness, but it's not really grounded in anything in particular about debate theory or kind of what the obligations of the AF are. And so judges are reluctant to impose those out of nothing or to like make them up from scratch. And so one way to solve this problem potentially is to try to make a vagueness argument that is a little bit more grounded in what we think of as the AF's obligations, right? So what are the AF's obligations? You probably know them as the stock issues. Yes. What are the stock issues? Can someone recap those? So I mentioned topicality. What are the other ones? Do we know what the stock issues are? Really? Okay. Interesting. So I did this lecture at the GDS too, and I was also like, most people also didn't know what they were, and I was kind of surprised. Yeah, what do you got? Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Are those terms ringing a bell to people? Yeah, okay. So yeah, maybe burdens of proof isn't the name that you might have heard for them. It is interesting though that like, I mean, it's not surprising that this is true, but the relevance of these is kind of declining over time, and people don't really vote for these as a standalone anymore, except for like topicality. Advantages we think of as being where you do the solvency debate, so it's not really like a thing that happens on its own, right? But originally, the idea of the stock issues was that it's this list of 5 things where the AF has to demonstrate these things as true, i.e. they have the burden to prove these things before the neg has an obligation to respond to anything that the AF has said. That was kind of the core idea. So the phrase burdens of proof to describe these ideas is meant to be a contrast to the phrase burdens of rejoinder, So like burdens of proof, that's what the AF has to demonstrate. And then if the AF meets their burdens of proof, that creates a neg burden of rejoinder, which is the idea that the neg then has to rejoin or respond to or disprove the things that the AF has said with disadds or responses to the burdens of proof or stock issues or whatever it may be. Does that basic idea track to people? Okay. So the core idea of this elective is that we can formulate a vagueness argument as an argument about why the AF team has failed to meet their burdens of proof and therefore has not made an argument that rises to the level of demanding a rejoinder from the neg. So not as a voting issue, but as a reason that the AF has just failed to demonstrate or failed to meet the prima facie burden that is required for the neg to be burdened with the obligation of responding. So in particular, we're going to focus on 3 burdens of proof that can help us accomplish this, which are inherency, solvency, and topicality. So topicality is easy. We talk about topicality all the time. Topicality is the idea that the topic requires the AF to do something, and the AF has to demonstrate that the plan that they're reading is an example of the topic. Solvency, seemingly also pretty easy. We'll delve into the details behind that one. But I'm going to start with inherency because I feel like this is the part where like most people lack the most background, I would say. So if you had to give a definition of inherency, what would we say? Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of similar to uniqueness. I'm surprised that you didn't say the plan hasn't happened yet, which is how most people learn inherency. Have people had inherency described that way? Plan hasn't happened yet. Yeah. The origin of the term inherency is that the AF is supposed to demonstrate that there is an inherent problem with the status quo. So there is something inherently wrong about what is taking place now. And part of that is that the plan hasn't happened yet. Part of it, as you're saying, is that there are harms or problems, one of the other stock issues, and those harms cannot be resolved except by deviating away from the status quo, except by doing the plan, right? It used to be the case that there were a variety of kinds of inherency. Does anyone know about these? There was structural inherency, there was existential inherency, and attitudinal inherency. We're getting really deep into the weeds here, but I promise we'll circle back to how this helps us. So existential inherency, that's the really basic kind, which is the plan hasn't happened yet, the plan doesn't exist. Structural inherency is broader than that. It says not only does the plan not exist, but also there is some element to the structure of the status quo that is preventing the plan from happening. That could be a legal barrier. It could be some other kind of very, very rigid arrangement. The idea of this is that the status quo is more than just a snapshot of the state of the world as it is. Instead, the status quo is a trend. It's a trajectory. It's like the course of, events or the course of policy that we're undertaking now. And that course of policy doesn't necessarily need to be static, right? So for example, the course of current policy is to withdraw from Afghanistan, right? Clearly. That if there were currently troops in Afghanistan, or like if we imagine that we're debating about an Afghanistan plan in the middle of the Afghanistan withdrawal, the status quo is not however many number of troops is in Afghanistan. The status quo is an overarching trend to withdraw from Afghanistan, which means that under this understanding of inherency, a plan that says finish withdrawing from Afghanistan would not be inherent because the status quo has adopted a policy course that is aligned with the plan. So it is not structurally inherent because the structure of the status quo is aligned with what the current policy course is. Does that make sense? Okay. Attitudinal has kind of fallen out of favor. This was basically the AF had to demonstrate that the plan is unpopular or that the plan was not going to happen as a result of changes in public opinion. Same idea, the idea being that like you have to demonstrate that the current policy course is not going to include the plan. This metric has kind of fallen out of favor though, unsurprisingly, given the rise of the politics DA, people decided like, hey, it's probably pretty unreasonable to expect the AF to proactively read a politics link against themselves. So that's kind of the broad idea. The goal of all of this was to create a division of ground between the AF and the neg, right? So by adopting an expansive definition of what the status quo is, right, And obviously the AF has the burden of making a change to the status quo. If we understand the status quo broadly, that expands the amount of ground that the neg has, because defending any element of the status quo is in opposition to the plan. Does that make sense? Kind of, yes, maybe. So the idea then is the AF has to defend not just a change of some kind, but a dramatic change, a change away from the policy course, not just the snapshot of the status quo, narrowly understood, right? And so gradually speaking, we've kind of moved away from this language of talking about this set of issues. This language was actually kind of the origin of, what's up? All good. So this language was kind of the origin of counterplans, actually. So before there were counterplans, people would say the AF is not inherent because minor repairs to the status quo that are not structural or that do not radically overhaul the current policy trajectory would solve the case. And so therefore the AF is not inherent. And now we kind of understand that as counterplans. And the reason for that is that we shifted away from an academic or persuasion paradigm to a policymaker paradigm. We're no longer like academics who are arguing about broad stuff through persuasive speeches. We are more like pretending like we're making policy demands on a person who's making policy, and that's kind of where fiat comes in and blah, 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 blah. Like you all are familiar with this version of debate. So the reason I say all of this is that you may think it is impossible to beat an affirmative that is vague on inherency, but you would be wrong. On the college climate change topic, which was the topic in 2016, 2017, one of the teams that was in the final round of the national debate tournament was a team from Georgetown, Natalie Knez and Ezra Luvis. This team, extremely good team. Ezra, one of the best 2As in the country. Natalie, arguably the best 2N in the country. They show up to their season opener. They're reading an AF about methane emission regulations. And they like win their debates in the prelims, but they finish as the second seed going into the elims. Northwestern's B or C team, I don't remember which, but they had cut some cards that were just basically saying like, the status quo is going to adopt the plan. The status quo course, they like began phasing in the emission regulations. They passed, they like haven't been formally adopted yet, but the current policy course is on a trajectory to adopt these regulations. And Georgetown had nothing. They had like 2 cards that were saying like the emission regulations are in the process of being implemented. They're not fully implemented. There's a possibility they get derailed by litigation. Northwestern made inherency all 9 minutes of the 2NC and won on like basically an instantaneous 3-0. And there were a couple of tricks to how they accomplished this. One was that they emphasized this thing about inherency that I've been talking about, which is that the status quo is not a snapshot, it is a trajectory. So they used that argument to kind of defeat Georgetown's response that the snapshot status quo has not yet implemented the regulations. 2 is that they coupled this argument with offense. Have you heard of like offensive strategies that are that resemble the term or based on the term gradualism counterplans or gradualism disads? So broadly speaking, this is a genre of strategies that is designed to say the status quo is gradually going to do stuff that solves the case, but the plan's abrupt move is disruptive in some way. And so most of the 9 minutes that Northwestern spent talking about inherency in the block, which by the way, they actually introduced as a topicality argument. They read it as T increase. The plan doesn't increase restrictions on emissions. They read like a violation card, and then in the block, this was all inherency. So what they did for most of the 2NC was that they read gradualism arguments. They said, look, here's a bunch of cards that say the plan is gradually getting phased in now, right? Stuff is getting restricted, or in the water topic example, stuff is in the process of getting regulated, right? But the plan is so abrupt that to the extent that the plan departs from the status quo, it is only by cutting short this process, by replacing this gradual policy change with an abrupt implementation. So it was kind of a double bind. Georgetown's big trick against disadvantages was that they would say, like, the plan doesn't happen immediately necessarily. There's this phase-in period. Everyone gets consulted. The plan gets rolled out. It's like really, really good for businesses. They're all involved in the process. Everyone knows what's going on. And Northwestern got them in this double bind where they were like, look, this gradual implementation thing is what is happening now. The plan doesn't say you deviate away from that, but to answer inherency, you have to say that you do. And when you say that you do, we have a disadvantage about that deviation. Going faster hurts the planning process. It hurts business confidence. It makes people really, really upset. A lot of Georgetown's cards even said this. So that's kind of one strategy that you can deploy in order to punish vague AFs, is this inherency-based strategy, right? Another thing that they did was, like I said initially, they coupled this with a topicality argument. So inherency, like I was saying earlier, not the most popular thing for judges to vote on in 2022, whereas topicality is much more commonly accepted, which means phrasing your inherency argument as T increase is one viable way to improve your chances of winning on an inherency argument. Finally, it's important to emphasize the burden of proof aspect of all of these arguments, right? So plan text is vague, right? Some versions of the plan text meet the inherency argument or the topicality argument. Other versions of the plan text do not meet the vagueness argument or the topicality argument or the inherency argument, right? So plan says nothing. There's a range of possible outcomes that are within the plan. The reason it's important to emphasize the burden of proof aspect is that it is the AF's burden to demonstrate that the plan text, in fact, meets the inherency stock issue and the topicality stock issue, right? If the plan has some versions of it that do meet and other versions of it that don't, the AF has not proven that they meet, right? Does everyone follow that? So an important aspect of this block was that Northwestern emphasized that, like, look, you could win the debate if you could definitively demonstrate that the statement of the plan text is not happening now. But the burden is on you to do that. It is not our burden to demonstrate definitively that the plan is not happening now. You're the ones who have to introduce definitive evidence that it isn't. And so that flipping of the normal way that debate works, right, which is that once you introduce an argument, it's automatically assumed to be true until it's disproven. It's different for the burdens of proof, right? Because of what they're called, the burdens of proof. So that's kind of the final wrinkle. A common thing that AFs run into, or that negs run into when trying to execute this strategy, is this argument that the AF gets to define what the plan text means. So the plan is vague in the 2AC. And I'm sure when you debated that CJR topic AF, where they just like read the whole resolution, if you accuse them of being vague, their re-raise would just be like, well, we're AF, we get to define what the plan means because it's our plan, right? Or we did define what the plan means. We read solvency evidence that describes what the plan does, right? This gets us to our second stock issue that is relevant for our conversation, or I guess our third, because I sort of previewed how topicality interacts with all of this. But so solvency. This is kind of the most complicated aspect of this, but bear with me here. So to get into the weeds of this, I want to step back and ask a more basic question, which is about fiat. So everyone is on the same page about what fiat is, yes? Okay. Why does the AF get fiat? Where does it come from? Yeah. They do establish the plan text, but like, how do we know? What about the rules of debate tells us that the AF gets fiat? Yeah.
Well, sort of like debate the effects of a plan rather than like the entire debate just being like on the single aspect and trying to get that.
So that's a good argument for why fiat is good, or like it's good that we give the AF the power to fiat. But like there's something about the structure of debate that objectively tells us that this is how debate should work. It's in the neighborhood. It is should, right? Should is what tells us what the topic of debate is about. It is whether the USFG should increase security cooperation or should not increase security cooperation, right? if the topic said the USFG will increase security cooperation or will not increase security cooperation, that would tell us that considerations of whether or not we can actually get the government to adopt our policy are relevant to our conversation, right? Whereas because it says should, it does not negate the statement that the USFG should do something to say that they will not do that thing. Does that make sense? So in a 1AC, where does the AF's fiat come from once they've actually presented their plan? Since it comes from should in the resolution, fiat in the 1AC also comes from the word should in the plan, right? Fiat is an extraordinary power. It lets the AF bypass solvency questions, questions of implementation, questions of resources. You know, we used to make people put those things in the plan. Like plan text used to say things like, the plan will be funded in the following way. The implementation schedule will be as follows. And they would like lay it out from their solvency cards in the actual plan text. Nobody does this anymore, which is, you know, but I'm not saying we should return to that. Like, fine, whatever. Like, we can be reasonable here. But, you know, these things are things that the app just gets to imagine away because fiat is such a powerful tool, right? We can use fiat to get out of all of that stuff. But the app's ability to invoke fiat is a bargain, right? Anything that the AF says should happen, which, to remind everyone, the Venn diagram of things the AF says should happen and things that they are fiating is a circle, right? It's the same set of stuff. We know that everything that they say should happen is fiated, as long as it's in the like advocacy statement. If the AF says something should happen, those are things that the neg can say should not happen, right? Those things are dised links. Those things are counterplan ground, right? Those are things that the neg has the ability to pick out of, right? So there's a trade, right? And yet with these vague plans, it seems like there's an asymmetry, right? Where like the app will stand up, they'll read their plan will be super vague, it'll say nothing. Then they'll read a solvency card that is like, it's the following thing. Then the neg will stand up and be like, okay, well, you read the solvency card. I guess we'll counterplan to do something different. That is still an example of the plan text. And then the app will be like, no. You don't get to read that counterplan because our plan text said nothing. So all that we said in our should statement was that like, there should be criminal justice reform, or like there should be water rights, or like there should be water market regulations. And that means your counterplan is not competitive. You haven't disagreed with the thing that we said. So it's weird, right? It seems like the AF is making the claim that they should be able to fiat things based on their solvency evidence, but then the neg does not get to say those things should not happen. So it's kind of an interesting misalignment, right? So how does this all connect up to the solvency burden of proof? Well, essentially, neg teams should make the case that if something is not in the plan, it is not fiated. Or rather, it is subject to debate, right? Based on normal means evidence. The neg should then argue that if the plan text is vague and it is unclear based on the plan, whether the plan even does the things that are asked for by the solvency evidence, the AF has failed to meet their burden of proof of solvency, because the thing that they have said is a good idea does not necessarily line up with things that their evidence says would solve, right? So again, an example. The United States federal government should regulate water markets, right? They read that plan text, then they stand up and they read a card that says, it would be a good idea if there was a cap on total water consumption in the Western United States. The neg would then stand up and say, all right, you have said your plan is regulate water markets. All that this entitles you to fiat is that there is some water market regulation, right? And we know this again because of the counterplan issue. If the neg counterplanned to do anything that involved the realm of regulating water markets, the AF would respond with perm to the counterplan, right? Like if the neg said anything, if the neg was like, let's do a 1 cent tax on water consumption, like a 1/100th cent tax, right? The neg would be like, yeah, perm to the counterplan, or the AF would be like, perm to the counterplan, that's an example of regulation, it doesn't disprove our plan text, right? But then if the neg stood up and said, well, but that means you haven't actually fiated a cap on water consumption, the AF would be like, oh no, we get to define our plan as whatever. So the neg should say, look, you have to choose. You can either fiat something meaningful or you can fiat something meaningless. If you fiat something meaningless, you need to read cards that meaningless thing solves. You need the words in the plan to line up with the words in the solvency card. And you need the solvency card to have introduced an argument for why the meaningless nonsense in your plan actually solves a harm. What's up? Which one?
That one that says that it's established,
Like which labs is what I'm saying. KM. Okay. Yeah, I wanna open up the 1AC so we can take a look at what this plan says. Okay, thus the following plan. The United States federal government should increase its commitment under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty to include responding to cyber threats. So I actually don't think this is that vague necessarily. There's just a weird grammar thing, which is like, what does expand or increase ... to include mean? But so the way that you would execute this strategy broadly is you would say, all right, counterplan, the United States federal government should reserve the right to respond to cyber attacks under Article 5, right? That's the SQO, by the way. If the app stands up and says, perm do the counterplan includes under Article 5 responding to cyber threats. In making this argument, the app has said, we are not fiating anything more than what the counterplan does, because the counterplan includes the entire plan. Does that make sense? Once the app says that, if you then on the case say circumvention, Article 5 in response to cyber is unpopular, it would be implemented in the most minimal and most restrictive way possible. The app does not then get to stand up in response to that and say, oh, fiat solves, we like fiat an expansive good faith interpretation, right? If you fiated it, we would have gotten to counterplan out of it. Since you said we didn't get to counterplan out of it, you are not fiating it. It's you have to pick and choose, right? And crucially, even them not making, so like even if they make the fiat argument to respond to circumvention, like even if they choose that route, you can still win on you have not met your solvency burden of proof. Because again, burden of proof means you are obligated to have forwarded an argument that is complete, that actually refers to the plan in the solvency card for why your plan that you've presented solves a harm, right? By saying we are asserting that we have fiated through this thing, they have not done this. What they have in fact done is they have read a plan that does one thing and a solvency card that says a different thing would solve a problem. Imagine a different hypothetical in which I said, I read this plan text, the USFG should increase its commitment under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty to include responding to cyber threats. And then I read a card that said, AI-powered cyber defenses are extremely effective and would contain all cyber risks. And then you stand up and you're like, what the fuck? You like read a plan and then you read a solvency card about something else. And then the app is like, no, we're the app. We get to define our plan as whatever we want. Clearly absurd, right? If all that the app had done was present that card, every judge would vote neg on solvency. You have not actually, done the thing that you're describing that you're doing, right? So that's kind of the answer to vague plans, or like app gets to define their plan means that like they automatically meet any of the solvency or inherency arguments, right? Is that fiat is a bargain. To claim fiat, you must specify that you must say in your plan that the federal government should do the thing that you're fiating. And that requires, yeah. So if the app has fiated something, the neg must be able to counterplan out of that thing. If the app asserts that the app does not get to counterplan out of that thing by making a permutation to the counterplan argument, they're disclaiming the right to fiat that thing. The fiat, sorry, what do you mean? Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yes. Or they disclaim the ability to fiat any more than that. So if it is a possible version of the plan text to do the bare minimum thing that the counterplan does, it cannot be the case that the app is fiating more than what the counterplan does. you see what I mean?
Yeah, so then you were talking, you said something about circumvention that it's
So circumvention is how you trick them into kind of this double bind, which is, and so this is kind of similar to the like gradualism disad. So a takeaway that you're hopefully getting out of this a little bit is that completing the theory argument, because the theory arguments are kind of unpopular or people don't really think that inherency or solvency are voting issues on their own anymore in 2022. An important part of this is that the mirror image of the violation needs to be coupled with some kind of solvency or with some kind of like substantive argument. So with the inherency thing, that's gradualism, right? Policy course of, SQO is going to result in the plan now, short circuiting it by doing something quickly is bad. With the solvency thing, the equivalent of that is you do a counter plan that adopts a very, very minimal, like do nothing version of the plan to get them to permute it. Then you make a circumvention argument on the case, to which they will respond by saying that they fiat through it. And then that illustrates a couple of things. One, it lets you concede the permutation to the counterplan argument to be like, this proves that this is a possible version of the plan, which means that it cannot be the case that fiat precludes this from being the way that the app is implemented, right? And the circumvention arguments prove that that minimal version is how it would be implemented, which means that you don't solve. And when they try to fiat through circumvention, that helps you with your abuse story. It helps you basically say like, look, the fact that they didn't put this in the plan is proof of like why this is such a problem and why you have to hold the line on what they get to fiat, because they're going to opportunistically decide what they're fiating and what they're not fiating based on what the arguments are in the 1NC. Like if we hadn't read the counter plan, we would never know that a possible interpretation of the plan text is to do like nothing, right? And it's the same thing with like agent stuff, right? If the plan text says something vague like USFG and then reads a court advantage, right? And then the neg reads a counter plan to have Congress do it. Some people think that that's automatically competitive. That's not quite what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that if the AF can stand up and say, perm do the counter plan, the plan says USFG and Congress is an example of that, the neg also gets to read solvency cards that say the most likely interpretation of the plan would be Congress, so you don't solve your court advantage. Does that make sense? Kind of, yeah.
I have a question about like circumvention in general. So
Yeah.
How can the app like got out of circumvention when like, I don't know, my understanding of circumvention is like this. So it's similar to talking about like I guess the emissions topic, and the app like fiats that like there's some regulation on emissions. And
Yeah.
like, circumvention would be like, oh, the biggest company like that produces emissions, just like if not, that would be like circumvention.
That's one version of circumvention. So here, let me give an example that's more relevant to this topic. So with the cyber Article 5 app, right? I think the most fruitful way to think about it is it's kind of like layers of an apple where there's like a core that's definitely fiated. There's an outer layer that is like maybe fiated. And then there's an outer layer that's definitely not fiated, okay? So with the cyber Article 5 app, right? Here's our 3 layers. So layer 1, definitely fiated, right? So things that are unambiguously foreclosed by this plan text and are clearly negative ground, right? So it is impossible for the world of the plan to include no possible coverage of cyber attacks under Article 5, right? That is clearly mutually exclusive with the plan. So we know that under the plan, some cyber equals A5, right? Which cyber? Unclear. All that the plan unambiguously forecloses is that no cyber is covered by Article 5, right? Now, in your 1AC, as I remember, the first solvency card is quite aggressive. And it says like propaganda is covered by cyber Article 5. It says like minor cyber attacks or like reputation hits on individual public officials or like information-based attacks on institutions. All of that is acts of war that triggers Article 5. Am I remembering this correctly? Right? So clearly based on the plan text that we just read, none of that is like required by the plan, right? So I would say this falls into this category, right? So info, like low level stuff. May be covered by the plan's fiat, right? There are possible interpretations of the plan text that include this. but there are also possible interpretations of the plan text that don't include this. So this stuff is maybe fiated, right? And then there's stuff that is clearly not fiated, which is, I don't know, like bioterror, right? Whatever. So if I were to pick out a bioterror, that's obviously not competitive, right? If I were to stand up and read a counterplan that says, I agree that some cyber attacks should be covered by Article 5, but it should be a high threshold, right? Let's say I read the high threshold counterplan. But then on the case, I make a circumvention argument. I say, look, the plan text is very vague. All that the plan fiat is that some cyber will be covered under Article 5. The US is very conservative about expanding Article 5, which means they would adopt the most limited interpretation of this possible, which means on case, circumvention, high threshold. Yes. So now the AF has to choose, right? They can either make the argument that says, we do include this stuff, in which case they beat the circumvention piece, but link to the counterplan. Or they can choose, we don't include this stuff, in which case they beat the counterplan, but they link to the circumvention argument. And none of this forecloses your ability to make additional theory arguments about how the plan should be interpreted, right? So this again is how, so like including this as a 1MC option generates abuse, which helps you demonstrate the theory argument for how the judge should go about interpreting the plan, basically, which is the AF is going to stand up and be like, oh, read our solvency evidence, or oh, read our, like, defer to what we said in cross-ex, or like defer to what we put in our tags, or like defer to our speech explanation because we're AF and we get to say whatever we want, right? And doing this, right, helps you demonstrate those are terrible ways to figure out what the AF is fiated, because the AF will just make it up every time, right? Imagine an alternative world in which, actually, this might not even be an alternative world, because I think you read multiple solvency cards that describe multiple different possible thresholds, right? Like one of them sets a really, really low threshold. Others of them are more abstract and just say that like Article 5 is a useful tool in responding to cyber stuff. Others are vague and just say there should be a threshold, but don't specify what it is, and say that like we just need a threshold in order to create NATO cohesion, so we're not confused when a cyber attack happens and we're all on the same page, right? How would a judge who is deferring to solvency evidence know which one of those is the real plan? There's no way to know, right? Maybe you look at the tag, and the tag of one of them says like the plan solves, and that would be like the one, but then we're ultimately just deferring to the AF, right? And if we're deferring to the AF, who's to say that the AF then doesn't get to stand up and clarify like, oh, no, when we said the plan solves, we were just reading that card as like a more general card about like the viability of thresholds, and like we didn't highlight all of the stuff that you're picking out of, so that means that we're not endorsing it. And like, again, all of this is happening in the 2AC once they've already seen what the 1NC is, so there's no check on the F doing all of the shit in bad faith and just like making it up depending on what the neg was talking about and what's the most convenient for them in this particular debate. So if you want, right, you can choose whatever the AF chooses. If the AF tries to not choose, you can be like, fuck you, you can't do that. We're conceding one of these things and we'll pick whichever one is our favorite. Or even if the AF tries to choose, you can use all of this as a demonstration of abuse for a theory argument that is like, no, you get only the stuff in your plan. You don't get the extra stuff in your solvency evidence. We get to read normal means evidence that describes whatever's going on. Circumvention, you fail the burden of proof. We don't have to respond to anything you said. Does that package broadly kind of make sense? Okay. Do you want to try another example of this? Yeah.
Isn't there like on this topic like the fourth area, I guess, which is that the potential of the US like
Good point. So I think stuff that clearly is not fiated includes NATO say yes. Right. I think that is an argument that I think would fall under the class of things that are arguably considered circumvention, but doesn't really help us here because that's never really even arguably part of the things that the AF fiats. But that's a good point. Although if you do say this and the AF tries to say that they fiat through NATO say yes, I would ask them a lot of questions about that, because that is suspicious. Does that kind of make sense? So the topicality aspect has more to do with, so by default, the topicality aspect has more to do with inherency, because you can define increase to mean deviation from the status quo. But that's a good point, which is, I think another aspect of the topicality argument is that you can define various words to raise the bar on how much specificity is required from the app. So things that I would recommend investigating on that front include resolved, means firm or committed, and say that if the app is vague or wishy-washy about what the plan does, they are not firm or committed. Substantially means real, having substance, actually implemented as opposed to a potential implementation. Security cooperation, to prove that, once again, the definition would be something along the lines of security cooperation means definite, actually in place, not merely potential. A cooperation program is not actually a cooperation program until an actual program or an actual exchange of some sort is going on. Does that make sense? So all of these, once again, are designed to force the app into this like triple bind action, where like the app is going to respond to this stuff by saying we meet, we do create an actual security cooperation program, we fiat it, right? And then you can re-raise by asking, okay, you said you create a real security cooperation program with a concrete set of parameters. What are those parameters, please? Do they include a high threshold or not? Right? If you don't know, then you have not fiated an actual security cooperation program, because you have not fiated that somebody goes to a place and says a thing. Your app might result in people going to a place and saying a thing to NATO that would be topical, but you have not used fiat to do that. And your fiated action is what has to be topical, not result of that fiated action. Does that make sense? Okay. A last set of ideas. So yeah, a last set of ideas that I want to highlight to respond to this like app gets to define their plan however they want thing is you should emphasize that the app should not be allowed to lie. That's like kind of the core that underlines all of this. But like when the app permutes this and fiats through this, they are lying about what the plan does. It can't be both of these things. So one of the interpretations of the plan is a lie. What is the problem with the app lying? Well, it means that we have no reason to believe them about what their proposal actually is. If the app is lying about what their plan does, just vote neg, right? Like if the plan is vague, you cannot tell from the plan if it solves because there are versions of the plan text that do not line up with the solvency evidence. We have introduced versions of the plan that don't line up with the solvency evidence, and the app has permuted them while at the same time claiming that they fiat through circumvention. Like the app has said a bunch of incoherent shit. We have no idea what the plan does. Neg on presumption. You have no clue if the app actually does anything that solves an impact. Yeah.
So you want to like read an impact to the app line using like Flash or something?
You could do that, but that's just like, so all of this is like, these are all theoretical justifications for why the neg should be able to pigeonhole the app into stuff that is not just based on the plan text. Like the neg should be able to read solvency cards. The neg should be able to read like circumvention cards. The neg should be able to pick out of clarifications. Basically, like the remedy for the app lying can be whatever you want. It could be that the app just loses on presumption and solvency, like no solvency is presumed. They like violate the solvency stock issue. It could be we should just assume that the counterplan is competitive because they're full of shit and you don't know if the counterplan is competitive or not. So you should defer neg because otherwise the app will always lie about the plan and there's no penalty for it. So so think of it also this way. Under their interpretation of what has to happen with solvency and app fiat, why wouldn't the app just read the resolution every time? Right? What's normally the penalty for the app reading the resolution? Like, what does the neg do if the app reads the whole resolution and then actually has to defend it? Yeah, disads and counterplans. You have a bunch of case negs. If they defend the whole resolution, you should be able to fiat. You should be able to pick out of any example of the resolution, read a disad to that thing. Literally every single case neg in your box becomes a pick, right? So why can't you do that? Well, because when the AF read the resolution, they actually meant something super specific that you can only figure out by scrutinizing their solvency evidence and by asking them cross-ex questions that they're never going to answer. That's terrible, right? That's like, that is the logical extreme endpoint of like the incentives that are created by allowing the AF to do whatever shenanigans this is, right? So all of this is the theoretical basis for forcing the AF to either be more specific, forcing them to do plan, whatever it is you want the remedy to be in a particular debate, right? You should craft your remedy based on the strategic value that you aim to be getting out of this argument. So not always they automatically lose, which is what you normally get or attempt to get by making a theory vagueness argument, but a tailored thing depending on what your strategy demands. Does that all make sense? Okay. So given what we've just talked about, what is the answer when the AF stands up and says, this is infinitely regressive? The resolution doesn't require us to give a specific solvency argument. The resolution doesn't require us to specify. You're going to demand more and more specificity over time, so just reject this, it's arbitrary. What's the answer? We have several up on the board here.
Counterplaying something that we can do possible under the memory. That's not.
Right. So part of it is just like, this is not a resolution-based theory argument. This is a theory argument about how to interpret the plan text in light of various kinds of evidence that we have to support varying interpretations. Right. So the penalty is not what the infinite regress argument presumes that it is. What else do we have? Topicality, exactly. So it's not infinitely regressive because our stuff is grounded in the topic. We have definitions of the topic that say what needs to happen in order for you to meet the topicality burden of proof. I'm going to send to your lab leaders to make available to you the pile of cards Northwestern read against Georgetown on this inherency thing, just so you all can see an example of what this kind of strategy looks like. Yeah, do you have any last minute thoughts, musings about any of this? Does this kind of make sense, more or less? Yeah, okay. Basically, the core takeaway of this should be, you should not pigeonhole yourself into making theory and like reject the team the only remedy for a vagueness issue. There are other ways to punish the AF, and they intertwine with the different stock issues in a way that helps you reduce the accusation of arbitrariness, and in a way that helps you demand different remedies than just rejecting the AF in a way that helps you with whatever broader strategy you're pursuing.